So I've got a little bit of, so my issue was, yeah, I feel like maybe there's a wave, there's something happening right now in the industry, and I've been feeling it for a while. One build, multiple exports was my problem. So running the build 4 times in one pipeline was just too slow, and Bitrise is slow anyway. Most people just gem install Fastlane, and they use fast files, and they have all their stuff basically sitting there in some Ruby version that, some Ruby file that they don't really understand that they're writing Ruby. It's just a DSL for Xcodebuild, in my opinion. I'll prefix everything I'm saying before the end rant slide with "it's my opinion." We've gone through, so at Domestic Cat, we do lots of different client apps, so each project is slightly different. Some go out via enterprise, some hit the App Store, some go to App Center. It's all, everything's different. So we're sitting there wrestling with Fastlane most of the time. It's like, okay, some requirement comes in to submit a UAT build or something else to test flight or this and that. I found that most of the time you spend in the Fastlane documentation trying to work out what the action is to do a thing that is essentially just a wrapper around Xcodebuild. You're sitting there trying to work out what the code signing error is. The code signing error is just bubbled up from Xcodebuild, so why not learn how Xcodebuild works? So Xcodebuild and how it works is actually divided awkwardly across 2 methods, 2 things. You run man Xcodebuild, and that gives you the manual file, and that is an epic file. I don't know if I can get to it. It's probably a good screensaver. So Xcodebuild, that's a different one. So it's epic. It's all your options. It's all here. It's overwhelming. Overwhelming is the word. That's why I think a lot of people haven't bothered to sort of go through it. Inside Xcodebuild, when you get into the kind of nitty-gritty of how to code sign something, which I think is also what most of us spend most of our time dealing with, you've got to go to Xcodebuild help, and you've got to read about the export options plist. I'll get to that in a second. This is Xcodebuild. This is a normal project. If you've got your project set up with a scheme and a configuration, so a simple configuration is debug or release. If you're doing different things, I've changed my opinion of this over the last year or so in the same mindset as this. Use different configurations. So if you've got a UAT release and you've got a production release, just use 2 configurations. So for example, you've got your scheme. Sorry? Yeah, well, if your dependencies don't have the same named configuration, it defaults to release, which is the reason why I haven't used it previously. CocoaPods seems to get in the way and create all those intermediate configurations for you. I also don't like CocoaPods, but in that case, it's good. Set up your workspace, set up your scheme. This is like an example shell script. I pulled it directly out of the shell script I wrote for this project. Set up your workspace, set up your scheme. The archive path, you can make that up. It doesn't have to be .archive, it can be anything. But that's what I've called it. And then the dsims path is always /dsims inside the archive. And then you run Xcodebuild. Scheme, archive path, archive, and then if you want to add your own Xcode arguments into the command line, you just put them on the end, which is great for CI if you've got a build number or something like that. I'm not going into Xcode XC arguments, XC configs, but that's the gist. Workspace, scheme, archive path, archive. Then you end up with an Xcode archive on your machine. I'm ignoring code signing for the minute. I think there is a default, yes. It ends up inside the developer directory somewhere. But if you want to control it for subsequent requests, it's much easier to just tell it where to go. Yep. All right, so say I want to take this and I want to export it via ad hoc code sign it via ad hoc distribution, which is great for non-enterprise stuff up to App Center or whatever. Couple more variables. I've got my export path for the ad hoc. I've got my ad hoc export options plist. Then I just run Xcodebuild, export archive, archive path, blah, 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 those 3 things. Then you can find the IPA file it generates with this fancy script, which is just find the name with star.ipa, given your other variables. Bang, now you've got an IPA. Again, assuming you've got the code signing details installed. Now, the trick to understanding how Xcode archive, export, whatever it is, this one, export archive works is actually not in the manual for Xcodebuild. It's in the help for Xcodebuild underneath the export options plist distributing archives. And it actually is mentioned in the man file. It says, blah, 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 go and look at Xcodebuild help. So if it wasn't already complex enough and you're sitting there and you're going blurry, you end up here and you're like, ugh. Now that's how I had been the last, mind you, Xcodebuild has improved over the years, so I can't say that, you know, we've all been ignorant for the last 10 years. It's got better in the last couple of episodes of Xcode. So that's from the man file, and then we're going to end up, well, from there, I'll go back to my terminal here, and then you go into Xcodebuild help, and it's just another, it's this. Like, and this is all about, this is the most important thing, is how the export options plist works. If you read it top to bottom, it doesn't make any sense. So what I did on this, through this exploration is, I'm like, okay, I'm going to order all of these bits here that it's talking about in the context of how like in the context of what they do. So for example, compile bitcode is for non-App Store exports. Like, all right, I'm going to group all the things that are for non-App Store exports underneath the same headings. And all of a sudden, I swear, it started to make sense. Here we go. So generic settings, these apply to everything. The method that you would put in an export options plist is either App Store, validation, ad hoc package, and defaults to development. That's all it needs to say. It says this whole paragraph of things. Signing style is manual or automatic. Defaults to automatic if your export was automatic. Team ID is your portal team. For non-App Store exports, all you care about is whether you compile bitcode or not, and that defaults to yes, so you don't really care about it. And whether you want thinning, defaults to none, I'm not sure, but it doesn't really matter. And then App Store exports, upload bitcode, upload symbols. So they default to yes. Then it's provisioning profiles. If you go from this general settings, if you set the signing style to manual, which inadvertently you are doing when you export it yourself, you have to set the provisioning profiles key in your export options plist. That's your bundle identifier, and that's the UUID of the provisioning profile installed on your system. If you've got those set up, most of what Fastlane does is generate this file on the fly and then just pipe it into Xcodebuild or Xcode archive. That's a key component. That actually would be better documentation than what they wrote. Signing certificate, there's too much information here, but this is where that iOS distribution, iOS developer thing kind of comes out. You can also provide that specifically, but most of the time it can work that out. It defaults to, what does it say it defaults to? Based on the distribution, it kind of works that out most of the time. So here is an example, sorry it's a little bit small, but here's an example of the bare minimum plist you need to take that exported archive and end up with a build, an ad hoc build or an App Store build. So destination is export. That's actually the default anyway. Generate App Store information, false. Method App Store, provisioning profiles, there's that key again. Signing style manual. Strip Swift symbols, I think that defaults are true. There's your team ID, upload bitcode, upload symbols. That's all you need. Say I want to export to the App Store. It's the same code I showed before, but with a different export options plist. So you can actually differentiate between how you code sign your app based on that plist that you've got there. This isn't a completely exhaustive version of how to do all this, but the point is, it's the same thing between App Store and ad hoc. Then I'm like, okay, can I get rid of the upload to App Store thing? I trawled through the new iTunes Connect API that is meant to exist. The only thing it doesn't do is upload things. That's in some other set of documentation that's not referenced in Xcodebuild help or Xcodebuild. It's in some other thing. It's called ITMS transporter. It has existed forever. You can pick it, it's part of Xcodebuild. So it's part of the application loader app. You can see it, you sort of generate the transporter home thing here. If you read its documentation, it tells you what to do. You can take the IPA file you generated, you give it a couple of other variables, a couple of environment variables, and it'll just upload it to TestFlight. That's it. So the whole script that we took, that was all this Fastlane configuration and backwards this and that, we replaced with a couple of different configurations. And apart from assigning the variables from the CI, we're using Bitrise, assigning variables to local things. It's like 4 commands that you have to kind of work out how to read. And I felt that the key was taking that export options plist and kind of putting it in the right order. So I guess what I'm getting at is not to be harsh, but tools like Fastlane and those things, someone has just gone and read the documentation and wrapped it in Ruby, whereas really it's not that complicated, especially in 2019. These tools are actually really close. So you can, in a simple case, which I think, especially if you're in a position where you're a product company or you've got your own products and it's just sort of 1 or 2, a shell script to go from building, running the tests and uploading to TestFlight is pretty straightforward. I think fundamentally, and again, back to my opinion, I think fundamentally, like, I spent a lot of time writing iOS apps and distributing iOS apps. It actually wasn't that difficult. It only took probably took a day. I spent like a whole day once that day. Like, I was determined to get it right. But once you dig into the documentation, it's not too bad. Not anymore. I think when Fastlane came on the scene, all this wasn't quite as like handy. Now it's got a lot better. So that's my. I hope that spurs some interest in going to man Xcodebuild. ASC provider is, if you go to the documentation for ITMS transporter, you can log in with your details and it gives you the ITMS, the ASC provider. It's like your team ID sort of thing. It's pretty similar. It wasn't too hard to find. Yep, that's it. App Store Connect. That's all I've got for this one. Any questions?
It's not a question. Can you put this in the post, please?
Yes. I mean to type it up. I've got a gist where I took the. Am I on the internet? So my effort so far, I've got a gist where I've reorganized the Xcodebuild help, and I've annotated it further. And honestly, I refer to that all the time. So it's like, here's where it goes. Super handy. But yes, it needs to be in some other format.
Not a question, but a comment. There's a bunch of quick look developer plugins for the binder that will give you, like, you can quick look at IPA, you can quick look at provisioning profiles, things like that. They're super useful because you can just go spacebar and you do all in for the
Yep.
And there's the only thing you need then is there's a binder terminal command, we have to look it up, that will allow you to copy and paste out of the quick settings. So you can copy your provisioning profile ID data.
So hit spacebar and then you can copy it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you need those two things that makes it a whole lot easier.
Yep.
So debug and fix.
Yep.
Jesse, I might be a little bit slow, but so just going back to your original problem, you were sort of saying that your Fastlane setup was such that you were building from scratch 4 different times, was it, to get 4 different artifacts?
Yes. Yep.
And so you're saying that the benefit here is that you build once, but then you export the archive in different formats.
Correct.
Right. So do you think that's a case of where, does Fastlane not support exporting at all, or so it forces you to build from scratch, or is it just that you didn't know that was a possibility in Fastlane?
I was at this turning point where my whole Fastlane setup, I was just running it 4 times and doing 4 builds. I'm like, I need to work out how to get Fastlane to export from the previous build.
So you could either learn how Fastlane was doing what it was doing, or you could figure Fastlane out to try and get it to wrangle. So the blog post I just posted into the Slack basically says exactly that as well. But I think this is a case of like any kind of third-party library that is intended to make your life easier. It's great, you could be lazy, but then at some point, you know, it actually benefits you to understand the underlying thing, and it might be 3 lines of code for what you need versus you porting a whole massive, React Native library or a Ruby environment to do your builds.
If your build system runs on
And
React Native, I'd love to hear it.
And I haven't developed since probably about 2013, and this is just taking me right back to the good old days.
Yep. I was also on the topic of going, re-exporting things and recode signing things. Inside the Fastlane GitHub repo, inside the source code for Fastlane, is this amazing shell script called resign.sh that is basically fully documented, obviously well tested, and it's the shell script that Fastlane calls internally to do all of its recode signing. I'm like, just use that. But yeah, maybe Fastlane is becoming the kind of JSON parsing library of 2019, or maybe it's the sort of the unnecessary constraint abstraction that we don't need anymore because the APIs under the hood are getting a little bit more. But a rewrite of the Xcodebuild manual file and a rewrite of the Xcodebuild help file would actually make this much better. Oh yeah, so our builds were like 15 minutes times 4, so that was not going to work. So now it's 15 minutes times 2.
Do you think you will save 45 minutes not using Fastlane?
Not long, not long. Once reading the documentation and understanding like what I needed to do, no, not long at all. Super simple, just deciding on the paths and this and that. Very straightforward.